What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel snapper with the best decks for you to climb with to infinite and in infinite. To my mind, there are 4 decks that are legitimately good in the current metagame, and so we're going to start with the most exciting one of them, which is this Black Knight list that was popularized towards the end of last season by a player named XUNZZZ. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. There is no shot I will get it right. I am playing a build popularized by Lamby Series by way of his Discord, courtesy of Teledadman, and basically it is what you would expect Lamby to do. He has taken the normal build and he has replaced Sera with Legion because Lamby loves Legion. Now, what this deck is fundamentally trying to do is just be unfair. That's really all that's happening here. Now, it is a bit like the other Sera decks, but it has diverged significantly with the addition of cards like Legion, the addition of cards like Juggernaut, to its own real archetype. This deck is trying to cheat you. It is trying to play a Black Knight into something very, very large, and then that thing that is very, very large cannot die because it is now part of the Ebony Blade, which is now unkillable, and also you can't Shadow King it. That's pretty much what this deck does. You have to respect the snaps coming out of this deck because they are so serious. People need to snap with this deck aggressively in order for it to actually result in positive cubes, and that means you playing against it need to respect those snaps. This is a deck that has a relatively mediocre win rate, but a very high cube rate, because when the deck works, people are still not respecting the snaps enough. If you get turn 1 or turn 2 snapped on by this deck, they play a Black Knight, you probably actually are gonna die. They do have the things that kill you. So please understand what this deck is trying to do and whether or not you can beat it. Because a lot of the way this deck beats you and a lot of the way they get value is by snapping early and keeping you in the game. Now, the fundamental play pattern you're going to want to take a look at is whether or not you can beat arbitrarily large unit plus potential tech card. Not every list is playing the exact same thing. And for the record, that is the role Juggernaut is playing in this deck, which is to say, one of the other lanes gets arbitrarily large unit and or Shang-Chi, and then one lane gets Juggernaut because you can use Zabu to discount your 4s. That's pretty much what this deck is built around. It's that final turn tech card or arbitrarily large guy, or just 2 arbitrarily large guys. Sometimes they will play Ghost Rider and the Ebony Blade on turn 6, and that's really hard to beat. Sometimes they will play a tech card and Ghost Rider. Sometimes it'll be a tech card and Ebony Blade. Sometimes it'll be Juggernaut and Ebony Blade, or any combination of those things. And that's what this deck is leveraging to win the cubes that it does. Its turn 6 is so terrifying and so unknown, and there are so many different forms that it can take, and playing around one will lead to you losing to another. This deck gives you more headaches on turn 6 than anything that isn't playing Eliath. It is an extremely powerful list. I'm excited that it's part of the metagame, but please understand, snapping and retreating is everything when playing with or against it. Thanos Blob is the second of the 4 decks that I consider legitimate contenders this week, and this is a build I got from Batman. It's a Thanos deck that's built to beat other Thanos decks, and that's pretty much how I like approaching the metagame right now. If you're going to play one of these 4 decks, try and do a little bit to make sure you win those mirrors. This deck's mirror tech is Killmonger and Death. It's not as good as you think. Like, it's good, but it's not as good as you think. It's okay, but that's really a little bit iffy. Lockjaw is also good in mirrors, as long as your opponent is not also playing Lockjaw, and if you are, well, then the whole metagame ends up just being, who Lockjaw's harder. And that's not very fun, but, you kind of have to deal with it when that's the strongest thing to do. This deck is built to be the Thanos deck that has good matchups into itself and also has good matchups across the board. Like many Thanos decks, the main thing it's trying to do is win one lane with an arbitrarily large amount of power and then play the card, the Blob. The Blob is the main reason that this deck is as good as it is, because he is just way too big for his cost. When you play him in a Thanos deck, he is usually a 620 at the minimum, and can be as high as a 650 if you get lucky. And playing a 650 is a great way to win games. Now, this deck will put you in a lot of situations that can reasonably be described as 50-50s. And what I mean by that is you will have to guess what your opponent is going to do and then play to beat that. And a lot of the time, you're going to have to think through what they're likely to do in order to guarantee your wins. Thanos is a deck that puts your opponent in the same situation, though, so sometimes you can get value out of them just overthinking things and you just made the normal play. This is not something that I'd recommend necessarily doing at low ranks, but sometimes at higher ranks, this can actually work for you. That said, you do need to put a lot of consideration into early snaps with this deck. People have gone away from snapping on Mind Stone, and I think that's all right. But if you have Mind Stone and Lockjaw, you actually do have a turn 1 snap. That actually is that good, and you need to be taking advantage of it when it's in your hand. Other stones, maybe, right? Like your time stones are a little bit worse in this deck than you remember them being from other Thanos decks because you have more 6s and because you're not Professor X scamming people the same way you used to. The other thing that this deck has is a little bit of a clog on turns 4 and 5. There are these situations where like you want to be doing something that's like a 3 and a stone, but if you don't have the stone, you're just playing like a 3-on-4, and if that's a Killmonger, it makes your death cost like 4 or whatever, and then it's like, when am I playing that? There are definitely like this deck clunks a little bit is really what I'm getting at. Now, as far as Scar goes, if you did not buy the Battle Pass, he is very easily replaceable with Jeff. Honestly, I didn't love him in here, but he was pretty good in terms of, oh, I pulled a really big guy off a Lockjaw, and oh, sometimes he ends up costing 2. And when he does end up costing 2, the deck is really, really good, and the card is really, really good. It's just you have to actually have those hands in order for that to happen, which is another reason why your Mind Stone Lockjaw hands are so important to snap, because you roll downhill even more than a normal Thanos deck rolls downhill when you have Mind Stone Lockjaw. This is a really powerful deck. I wouldn't say there's like one specific build of Thanos that I think is that much better than the others. This is my preferred build, but there's just so much that can be done in the shell and still find success that I think that you are pretty much fine as long as you're playing the cards like Thanos and Blob, like the core cards that we actually know are in this deck. Nobody post in the comments where it's like, oh, he didn't mention that you need to play Vision. Shut up. Stop it. When Thanos is in the meta, you already know what else is in the meta. That is Loki. Loki is actually probably my pick for best deck. It was definitely the best one for me when I tested all of these lists. It was the one that had the most success for me. But maybe that's just because I play a lot of Loki and I'm very used to how to play this deck. Loki is a deck that is built to absolutely demolish everyone playing Thanos because you have their early game, or you have the Loki early game and the Thanos late game thanks to the card Loki. If I were you, I would enjoy this while you can. I'm not sure what's going to happen to Loki on January 9th, but I would imagine it is not going to be pretty. If it is pretty, I mean, maybe we'll revisit that at that time. I still actually expect him to be like the kind of thing that farms Thanos in the future, which is very funny because they managed to like, what the leaked nerf is he doesn't work with Collector anymore. And it's like, okay, he still beats the hell out of Thanos though. Like he's still absolutely whipping ass in that matchup. So that's sort of where I'm at with it. I don't really think there's a reason to play any other Loki build other than this one. And this does create a lot of sort of very inbred mirror matches. And they're not inbred the way you would expect Loki mirrors to be, Collector Loki. They're inbred on ongoings and Rogue. Like the main things that happen in these Loki mirrors are like Mobius jockeying for positioning, using Quinjet to protect your Mobius from Rogue, Miss Marvel, Rogue on Miss Marvel. Like that's actually what these mirrors tend to look like, much more so than the Loki Collector type mirrors that you remember from when the Loki deck first came out. So I think that this deck is a phenomenal pick right now. I think that there are some very specific tips that I can give you. The first one is when you're playing against Black Knight, you are a Miss Marvel Devil Dinosaur deck. Please make no mistake about that. You are absolutely a Miss Marvel Dino deck. You are not in the business of trying to take their cards and Loki them. You are in the business of playing a 5/17 and making it very difficult for them to win a lane with an Ebony Blade. If you have a Dino in the lane where they have an Ebony Blade that's like 12 power because of a Magneto, you are ahead and you force them to invest in that lane if they want to Shang or Enchantress you. That's how you approach it. Next up is Annihilus Bounce, and I've got 2 lists for you for Annihilus Bounce, and I'm not sure which one is better. This is the one that I was playing, but my instinct is that it is actually worse than the other list that I'm going to show you. I just feel like I had so much success with it that it is worth showing you. I really enjoy putting rocks in my opponent's deck. The whole package works well here, but you have a very defined weakness to the card Blob, and your lack of tech cards is a significant problem as well. This deck has no Rogue, it has no Enchantress, it has no Shang-Chi, which means that if you are trying to beat these Miss Marvel decks, you can run into some real problems, because they are playing what is probably the best card in the game, and you are not. However, you do have a lot of ways to just put a ton of power on the board in unexpected situations. You can also use your Hood and your Void off of an Annihilus in order to mess up their Miss Marvel and make it a less interesting card for them to play. Now, the main thing that this deck is trying to do is scam your opponent to death with the card Annihilus. This is a great Annihilus deck. It is a great Beast deck. And I think the real question as to archetypes is, do you play like this and invest in Darkhawk and accept that the Blob is going to end your life and you just don't play Darkhawk in those games? Or do you play the other way, invest in cards like Enchantress, Shang-Chi, and Zabu, and get rid of the Darkhawk and the rocks entirely? The interesting thing is that rocks are actually phenomenal against Thanos. They're an amazing thing to be doing. They're extremely, extremely strong, and getting rid of the rocks actually also makes your Thanos matchup worse. It's a very interesting deck building conundrum between this build and the other one. This is the other build, and I think that it is a little bit more, I would say, straightforward and a little bit less weak to specifically the card Blob because you're not investing in Darkhawk. But weirdly, I'm not sure which one has a better Thanos matchup, because the deck playing like Rock Slide and Korg and Beast and Black Widow is really good into Thanos, but the card Darkhawk isn't. And then you have this build, which isn't playing any of that disruptive stuff, but it's also not relying on Darkhawk. And that allows it to fit more tech cards in. Like this deck is a lot better at dealing with Miss Marvel, for example. The existence of Enchantress goes a long way for that. You have your Zabu plans in addition to your Beast plans, and you also have a Falcon in here, so you get to do a lot less of doing nothing. There are certainly some draws in the other build that involve you just like taking some really awkward, annoying plays, where it's like you're very used to bouncing all these cards up and getting all the value out of them, but because you're not running Falcon in the other deck, it's like, oh man, I don't really know about this anymore. That said, I think these two are roughly equivalent personally, but I would lean towards this build being better into a generic metagame. I do think that the fact that that the only card in here that actually hurts us when a Loki gets it is potentially Annihilus, potentially Shang-Chi, is pretty relevant. I think that's a good thing. The one thing that this deck does have to worry about, though, is that a lot of Loki decks are packing Mobius now, and you're a Zabu Beast deck, and you really need to be a Zabu Beast deck in order to have a coherent game plan. Because a lot of the time, your end game is multiple 4-cost cards that cost 3, and then multiple 1-cost cards that cost 0, and that just doesn't work if they have a Mobius on the board. Moving on to the decks that I would say are more tier 2 than tier 1, either on representation or on power. What I mean by that is these are either decks that aren't exactly as good as the 4 in tier 1 or aren't played as much as the 4 in tier 1. Because what I try to do with these videos is not just give you a perspective on what the best decks are, but a perspective on what people are playing and why. And I think those first 4 decks are the ones that you are going to see the absolute most of, whereas these decks you're going to see significantly less, and I think for good reason. The first of these decks is She-Naut. Kyera slots in quite well instead of Armor. I know people are like, why would you play Kyera over Armor? Armor costs less. And the answer is because you don't want to have your Nebula and your Sunspot in the same lane ever, and Kyera makes that happen. In addition, there are genuinely games where you are just playing out a big guy and saying, please don't Shang me, and Kyera is good in those situations. She gets that job done. Is she perfect? No. Does she go here? Yes. This is a deck that is very reliant on 1-drops and on 6-drops, and just that little bit of additional protection from Killmonger and Shang-Chi is relevant. In some games, she won't be doing anything. In games where you're not looking to split up your 1-drops and you're just getting rid of priority, she's not that good. But those aren't every game, and I think her effect is worth the extra expense over Armor. That said, if you don't have Kyera, don't spend 6,000 to do this. Like, go play Armor. It's fine. Relax. You're good. If you have everything but Kyera, put in Armor. You're good. Sizer's build of Lockdown is surprisingly underplayed, in my opinion. And I think probably the major reason why is that there are so many Miss Marvel decks that being the one who invests in closing off lanes puts you at a disadvantage versus the other Miss Marvel decks who are not investing in closing off lanes. That said, I mean, I find it hard to believe that this deck is actually that bad. I think it's quite solid. I've certainly lost to it. It has decent matchups into a lot of the top of the metagame, but it does have like some significant issues. For example, if you're a Storm deck, you have some trouble when Black Knight does the thing, because Black Knight is just going to dump an infinite amount of power onto that Storm lane and be totally fine winning another lane against you. And that is a major issue. And I think, if anything, when I talk about the other Miss Marvel decks, I mean Black Knight and Loki pretty much specifically. And those are the decks that give this deck a really, really hard time, because Loki gets all the cards that you are using to secure your Storm lane, and then Black Knight just plays a giant idiot on your Storm lane, and then you'd never have priority for your Alioth, and you're just sitting there like, why am I even bothering? And they both are decks that play like Zabu and Miss Marvel, so like they have a lot of ability to just get a ton of power on the board across a wide variety of situations. I think that, if anything, that is the reason why this deck has fallen a little bit off. But outside of those matchups, it honestly is quite solid. I really do think that this is a deck that can even maneuver around those matchups, because they do need specific cards in order for those kind of things to happen. They don't happen all the time. And when they don't happen, you absolutely are beating their ass. And I think that there is something to be said for that. This is a solid deck. I'm not the biggest fan of Lockdown as an archetype, but if you are a Lockdown fan, this is what I'd play. Now, I know people are going to ask, can you replace Echo? And the answer is no, because we just talked about how the other Miss Marvel decks kind of run you over if they get to do what they want and play Miss Marvel. Echo's the only way you stop that from happening. You can't replace her in here. She is actually that good. And I think that, you know, I probably wouldn't go out of my way to purchase Echo for this reason, because there was a leaked nerf to Miss Marvel that maybe makes her a lot less required in these situations. Sera Tech exists in a similar sphere to the Black Knight deck, but I think the value of the tech cards has gone down a little bit, and the amount of power that is being output has also gone down a little bit. And that is mostly because, like, imagine your opponent, who is a Black Knight gamer, gets a 20 power Ebony Blade and you can't do anything about it. This deck has problems with a 20 power Ebony Blade. Like, yeah, you can Enchantress and then Shang-Chi it, sure, if that's really what you want to do. But this deck, generally speaking, has problems with a 20 power Ebony Blade. It's hard to deal with. And in addition, I think Lokis have become a lot better into this deck as more people have started playing the dumb guy Loki deck that we've talked about a lot on this channel. That deck matches up very well into this, because it is also a deck that is playing Mobius, but it's doing power more efficiently at basically every other space of the game. So between Loki and Black Knight, this deck has lost some significant positioning in the metagame, in my opinion. Now, I do think it is probably still a very good list into Thanos, but the fact that you have to worry about Kyera in some Thanos decks now is also really annoying. The fact that Thanos decks are now playing some Professor X again, some Alioth again, like the fair Thanos decks, I've seen them and they exist, and that kind of sucks, because those are cards that you are not equipped to deal with in any real way. And of course, there's so much discount in the metagame that Mobius is in a lot of decks, and this deck is not equipped to deal with it. Now, you can actually cut Gladiator for a rogue because of these metagame dynamics. There's always going to be something you can do with a rogue here. Like, people like to talk like running rogue and Enchantress is too much. It's really not too much. Maybe you're not cutting Gladiator for it, but rogue Ench is a totally fine way to play the game right now. There are so many ongoings that matter. This deck falls into a similar situation as those Loki mirrors, where everything is about jockeying for Miss Marvel, for Mobius, and then the rest of what the deck does. So Rogue, extremely strong there. This deck still exists. It's very much carried by Leech. I'm of the opinion that if I were to play a carried by Leech deck, I would probably rather be playing She-Naut than this, but I think it's still an underrated and powerful way to play the game. I do think that Black Knight occupies a similar space to it, but, you know, that kind of is what it is. I've even seen some Black Knight decks playing Leech as well, and I think that adaptation is actually quite interesting to me. But the basic thing that this deck is struggling with is that Black Knight is doing kind of the same thing in the same space as this deck is, but Black Knight is doing it just a little bit stronger, in my opinion. You're leveraging the same thing, a big stat stick, and then some tech cards. It's just your big stat stick dies to Blob, and their big stat stick dies to nothing. Now, the advantage that this deck has is Disruption is genuinely very strong. Rock Slide and Korg are really, really, really good cards in this metagame when so many things revolve around having specific cards at specific times. Getting your opponent to draw a rock is actually just amazing, especially against Thanos decks. However, being reliant on a card that dies to Enchantress, Shang-Chi, and the Blob is a little bit harder than being a deck that relies on something like the Ebony Blade. Yes, it takes more setup to make the Ebony Blade work, but the payoff is so unkillable and so impossible to interact with that it does sort of put that deck above this one, and they're both doing kind of the same thing. I just wanted to highlight my ZooCOPEia deck. I definitely don't think this is tier 1, but I did a whole video on it, and its win rate actually is still like 56% post-infinite, so I'm pretty happy with that. It's obviously not like amazing, but for a deck that I've really wanted to be good for a while, to actually end up being kind of playable, I'm very happy with that. Like, I am genuinely happy that this deck that was basically complete garbage for an extremely long time is now an actual deck that can play actual games of Marvel Snap, and you can actually enjoy it. So I'm putting it on here as an honorable mention. For more, please check out my video on the list. You remember how I keep saying that running Enchantress and Rogue is like actually totally fine to do in this metagame? Yeah, so that means that this deck is not very good right now. And as a deck that loses to Enchantress, Rogue, and Mobius, all three of those cards are probably at not necessarily all-time highs, but like relative maxima here. This is a metagame that is as hostile to this deck as has ever been. I would not recommend playing it. I don't think you can get away with it. If you are in a world where you are not seeing any of those cards, I'm putting it on here for people who are in that world. I'm not in that world. Those cards are everywhere. They should be everywhere. It is correct that they are everywhere. And this deck, for that reason, is barely hanging on as an honorable mention. Speaking of barely hanging on as an honorable mention, if you want to go to the casino remains open. Hela is still a deck. I've seen some people cooking with like, oh, I'm going to play Black Knight and I'm going to play Ghost Rider in my Hela. I'm going to totally get them that way. But it's like, okay, don't do that. If you're going to do that, just go play the normal Black Knight deck. If you're going to play Hela, play Hela. Invest in Hela. Play the card Hela and summon a bunch of idiots and beat everyone's booty in. Like, this is a deck that does not need much introduction or explanation. Your job is to discard cards and then use Hela to summon them all back. With Jubilee and, of course, Lockjaw in the deck, you can reasonably assume that you're going to be looking at about 11 of your 12 cards. You are able to count on that, or at least gamble on that. This deck is a lot like, you know, going to the casino, playing blackjack. Sometimes when you hit, you're going to bust. That is what it is. But sometimes when you hit, you get 21. And that is what this deck is about. Those games where you play a Hela and it's 21 power out of thin air. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper. If you made it this far in the video, please remember to subscribe and turn notifications on. Like the video, leave a comment. Every single bit of that helps me. I still read every single comment, even the ones calling me unoriginal Loki gamer. It's true. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.